Majed Abdelaziz fa l'intervento speciale, sì. La Lega Araba.
Sì, però bisogna che la gente si sieda.
Adesso
perché sennò lo faccio appena si siede. Posso pregarvi di sedervi per cortesia? Perché sennò non incominciamo mai. Continuate dopo, tanto vi conoscete benissimo e sicuramente tutto andrà bene. No, devo presentare questo signore che fa l'intervento speciale, poi sei tu.
Sì, benissimo, mi dicono ancora 10 minuti.
Sì, perché dovrebbe essere, vedi. Questo signore. Eccolo qua. Eccolo qua. È il rappresentante della Lega Araba alle Nazioni Unite e i marocchini ci hanno chiesto. I am very proud to introduce to you Majed Abdelaziz, who is the permanent observer of the Arab League to the United Nations in New York. And I'm sorry that because of the lockdown, we would have liked to have you here in person. This proved to be not possible. And so, but we see you very well. And I think the system works. So I invite you to make your remarks, sir. Thank you very much for being there.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you for the NATO Defense College Foundation, and particularly to its president, Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, for hosting this important high-level conference on Arab Geopolitics 2020, the Middle East, what kind of future? I hope it is a bright future. In close cooperation with the Policy Center for the New South of Morocco and its president, my dear friend, Karim El-Ainawi, I believe this conference is of paramount importance at this particular political and strategic juncture, and in view of the close interconnectedness between Europe and the Middle East on many issues that would have an impact on our world at large. My thanks also goes to Dr. Stephen Mariano, the NATO Defense College Dean and new Commandante. And I feel really flattered to be given a standalone chance to speak to you. And I would not talk to the amount of or to the level of Dr. Capel, who started the meeting today, but I'll do my best to be as provocative and as interesting in the discussion, so that to provoke as many questions as possible afterwards. I believe, to start, let me say that I believe it was not just a coincidence that the Mediterranean Dialogue held its 5th edition here in Rome, virtually, in late 2019, shortly before the Atlantic Dialogue of the Center of the New South, which was held in Morocco. Both conferences at that time had in their leading themes the warning signs that the world is in turmoil. American withdrawal from many multilateral and bilateral commitments, including major withdrawals from applying international legitimacy rules on our Arab issues, most importantly, from its role as an honest broker between Israel and the State of Palestine, and replacing this role with a peace plan of its own that provoked international opposition. Changes in the dynamics of relations between the United States and its traditional allies in NATO and in the European Union in a manner that created doubts and uncertainty, let alone the changes introduced to the characterization of relations between the major powers, in particular between the United States on one side, the Russian Federation and China on the other. As the Arab world is just a small part of this evolving world, with all the surrounding environment I would assume you all would accept me to say that the Middle East is in turmoil as well. And it is really so. The analysis I will provide of the current situation globally, regionally, and sub-regionally does not reflect any official position of the League of Arab States, whom I have the honor representing at the United Nations in New York now. Neither my own country, Egypt, which I had the privilege of being its ambassador to the UN after about 40 years in diplomatic service, nor it represents the UN itself, which I was honored to work for 5 years and to deal exclusively with the African side of the work of the organization. What I'm going to talk about stems from the accumulated experience nationally, regionally, and globally over the almost those years of diplomatic and political experience, with a forward-looking vision that takes into account the inherent relations that connects Europe in general and NATO in particular with the Middle East region and from a geopolitical angle. To start, let us all agree that multilateralism as well as regionalism are in real crisis. The failure of the United Nations Security Council to deal with critical issues relating to maintenance of international peace and security is quite evident. In the last 2 weeks alone, veto power has been cast and used to prevent the adoption of resolution after resolution, merely deciding to extend the opening of crossing points that are needed to deliver humanitarian assistance to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. The power struggle in dealing with this issue between different powers was obvious, but this time it was using the suffering of innocent civilians by both sides to score political gains. In the meantime, Security Council was debating the Iranian nuclear file without any conclusive results, particularly with regard to the JCPOA, while Iran continues its interference in the internal affairs of Arab states in the Gulf, in Palestine, in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, you name it, and continue as well its support to the Houthis in their attacks on Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, and on the coalition forces supporting legitimacy, in complete defiance of Security Council resolutions. Tensions are also rapidly building up in Libya, where the fight against terrorist groups and jihadis is turning into foreign interference, but upon request of both sides of the Libyan crisis. And the victim will only be the Libyan people, who will have to pay the price for settling scores between European partners and between some of them and their Arab partners, depending on who they support. And even more, turning into one member of NATO claiming a share of the wealth of Libya and a share of wealth in the southern Mediterranean economic revenues of Arabs and others, and other NATO fellow members. All this within paralysis in the Security Council as a result of different alliances for different reasons. Moreover, and since the resignation of Ghassan Salameh, the Security Council has been consulting for almost 4.5 months and unable to agree on a nomination for a new leader for the UN mission in Libya, putting the peaceful settlement efforts at risk. Turning to the League of Arab States, the oldest regional organization that has just celebrated its 75th anniversary on 22nd of March this year, way before the UN will celebrate its 75th birthday next October. League of Arab States is willing, ready, but not able to play its desired role in dealing with the current turmoil in global affairs and its implications on its regional efforts. Here, I would like to stress again that my views are only mine and neither that of the Secretary General nor of the League itself. This inability could be attributed to several factors. Some of them are institutional, emanating from its charter, rules and regulations, which prevents resorting to vote in settling any issue. And the rule of unanimity is the basis for work. And relieves member states who express reservations on any of its resolutions or statements from the responsibility of its implementation. This is in a classical application of the national sovereignty principle by each of the member states of the League, which has and continues to be the basic principle for our operating scheme due to different factors. Those factors include primarily changes in the dynamics of Arab leadership after the disappearance of many Arab leaders as a result of the so-called Arab Spring, which changed the classical leadership scheme in the Arab world. As you all know, up till 2010, the Arab affairs were usually conducted through informal high-level contacts under the joint supervision and leadership of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Syria at the last part before 2011, reflecting the diversity of our Arab world between North Africans or the Maghreb region and the Sham region or the Mashriq, and the third is the Gulf states known as members of the GCC. But the 2011 uprising, with its different motivations and dynamics in different countries, came with serious ramifications that shattered most Arab societies, increased the appetite of some Arab countries towards playing more of a leadership role that does not correspond to their capabilities and against the will of other Arab countries. This in itself created a rift between groups and individual states in our region that had its negative impact on the ability of the League of Arab States to reach Arab collective actions and decisions, particularly on issues pertaining to maintaining regional peace and stability. This problem was exacerbated by the lack of formal structures in the League to handle effectively the peace and security issues, as well as the weak financial structure of the League, which limits its ability to undertake those responsibilities. And I would venture to say the lack of unified political will to allow the League to play this role against the sovereignty of its member states. All that, coupled with the feeling of insecurity resulting from the lack of effectiveness on the multilateral track of the United Nations in dealing with Arab security concerns, provided the reasoning for an unprecedented military buildup in the past few years in our region. It resulted also in an increase in the number of foreign bases on our lands, as well as strengthening of other bases in place already there. This buildup was not necessarily directed against neighboring Arab countries, rather than building increasing deterrence against foreign interventions from both Iran, Turkey, and others, on one hand, as outlined in many summit and ministerial resolutions by the League of Arab States, as well as interventions from other powers and actors bumping into each other on the Arab lands as well. What must be noted here is that most of those buildups are coming from NATO countries within their alliances and excellent relations with Arab countries, and that many of those parties fighting on the Arab lands are also NATO countries, either confronting each other or confronting those who has been considered as rivals in the past. What has an impact on those developments is the lack of a clear regional integration strategy whether at the sub-regional or at the regional level. If I turn shortly to how does the Arab world view its strategic relations with Europe and with NATO, the current turmoil and the American sudden withdrawal from many activities allowed the European Union to step in to fill the vacuum. We have seen this in much more unified positions taken by our European partners in the UN in dealing with critical issues of the Arab world in the Security Council, in dealing with the American recognition of Jerusalem, for instance, as a capital of Israel, in supporting the Israeli sovereignty, in rejecting the support by the Americans of the Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Arab Golan Heights, and in opposing the Peace for Prosperity American deal, and in opposing the plans for the new Israeli government towards the annexation of Palestinian territories. The joint European presidency of the Security Council, represented as of late by Estonia in May, France in June, and then Germany in July, represented the re-emergence of Europe as a leading factor in dealing with our issues in the Middle East. We trust that this will continue with the departure of Germany and Belgium and the beginning of the membership of Norway and Ireland in early 2021. But the question here also remains: what can the EU and maybe NATO do to help the Arab world achieve its objectives? Ladies and gentlemen, let me now turn to the question addressed to me by the organizers, whether the Arab region is in a state of strategic nuisance or strategic irrelevance. In my view, the Arab region is in neither situations. The Arab region has for long resisted reform for different reasons, but all attempts to reform the Arab region from the outside has failed. We all still remember the Greater Middle East Initiative and the Middle East Partnership Forum and many other initiatives that meant across the years to impose certain American or European reform standards and objectives on our region, particularly after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center and the paradigm shift it caused in dealing with the Arab region. But in the absence of a unified reform agenda and common Arab objectives that are homegrown, every country in our region went ahead with its own reforms individually. Reforms that would fit the characteristics of its society, its governing structures, whether republican, kingdom, emirate, sultanate, or otherwise, and what exactly it aimed to achieve in the final analysis. But despite the major advances each of our countries have achieved, there is no common thread that connect all those reforms in our countries together in a way that would allow us to form the effective bloc that is capable on its own of providing regional security without foreign intervention.
Thank you very much, sir. Have you much more to say? Because
No, just the last paragraph. You just came on time. I'm just saying the inner difference among countries of the Arab world about who is the lead and who is not, unfortunately resulted in a situation where each country has to choose its alliances inside and outside the Arab world. And I can stop here and continue the discussion with a Q&A.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for enlightening remarks. I hope that you hear the applauses here from the room.
I do. Thank you.
Dove mi devo mettere? Ok, perfetto, grazie.
Comme tu veux, hein?
I don't know how.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Can we? Good evening. Thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to our distinguished panelists and to President Alessandro Minutorizzo for promoting this meeting, and also to the NATO Defense College Foundation. As we can read on the background policy paper, and also as you listened before, Middle East is in turmoil. And despite the exception of Tunisia, in the vast majority of the cases, the old guard has been successful in neutralizing the revolutionary rise of 2011. We can remember that 9 years ago, maybe the main part of us was optimistic about the possibility to improve the level of democracies in societies that were not very used to democracy. But the analysis that we can do now is very different from the one that was very frequent to listen in the past. But anyway, we saw important protests in 2019. We have seen in Iran against the price increase of the oil and also of the gasoline, exactly, and also the high prices of some services. And they were, in the reality, protests against the regime. And we have protests also, different protests in Algeria, that although is not in the Middle East exactly as Morocco, but we consider in the Arab world very important. And the young people ask for more democracy and for a constitution, a new kind of political system. And we have seen protests also in Iraq against corruption, against the prices of the food, as in Lebanon. And in Lebanon also with a generational change, with young people asking to the system to be not just the multi-sectarian system that exists since decades ago, but able to represent a more mixed society. In this situation, we have also 3 wars, the worst and the longest in Syria, but another one that is it's been a bloody war in Yemen, and in Libya, a war different from the other ones, but that has been more similar to the Syrian one in the last year and in the last months, because it has become more than before a proxy war with different state acting inside it. We can talk about these and other issues with Mr. Robert Watkins, who has more than 35 years of experience working in political, humanitarian, development and post-conflict recovery areas. He has served as United Nations Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in Lebanon and in Afghanistan. And he worked for the European Commission as head of the European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations Regional Office for the Middle East. He was based in Amman, but he was covering a larger area. Then we will listen Mr. Ibrahim Humansur, who is consultant in geopolitics and global strategies. He is an associate research fellow at the Center for Arab and Mediterranean Studies and Research at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs, where he currently lectures as an expert in global strategy. With them, there is also Sofia Barbarani, which is a journalist, who is a journalist a focus on conflict and humanitarian reporting in the Middle East. From 2013 to 2016, Sofia Barbarani was based in northern Iraq, and she will talk about it. And she reported also about the rise and the fall of ISIS or Daesh in Syria. Then there will be connected with us Mohammed Lalishki, senior fellow at the Polity Center for New South, and before a Moroccan diplomat. You can see on the screen, and he has been ambassador of Morocco in 3 countries, and then to United Nations in Geneva and New York, as well as president of the Security Council, temporary president of the Security Council of the United Nations. And Ambassador Lalishki has been also president of the Counterterrorism Committee of the Security Council. I would begin with Professor Watkins, and one of the issues of our debate will be the relationships between the military and the civil society. Of course, we have different kinds of military forces in the Middle East and different society. But what can you explain these relations? How are they evolving or being in a involution in this historical phase?
Thank you very much, Maurizio. Welcome, everyone. I was asked a question for this presentation in the relationship between the military and civil society. And the question was, is it more of the same? And so I can sum up my presentation in one word. Unfortunately, I'm the pessimist, and I will say yes. The optimist in me would say yes for the time being, but I hope, like Mitch, that this is part of a long path, perhaps, but a path that is leading somewhere positive. I think I would like to make 6 points. So I'll make it very simple for everyone. Just 6 points that I would like to speak about in the short time that is allowed to me. First of all, about the nature of the changes in the relationship between the military and civil society throughout the MENA region. Of course, you're all very familiar with the MENA region, and you know it's an impossible question to ask because it's such a diverse region, and there's what has happened in Turkey is different from, so much different than from what is happening in Iraq and so on. But that being said, there have been a number of common threads throughout the region, this very large and diverse region, a number of common threads. And I think that the most important change that we have seen in the last 20 years, that is the 20 years of this century, is the proliferation in the number of people and organizations and groups involved in security. We are no longer dealing just with militaries and security services and intelligence services and so on. There has been an increase, a rapid increase in the number of power brokers, whether they be sectarian-based or ethnic-based or tribal-based, whether they're transnational jihadist groups or transnational criminal groups or non-state armed groups. The multiplicity of the actors has complicated the relationship between the military and civil society hugely. It has never been an easy relationship in this region, but now it has been extremely complex. The second point I would like to make is that, well, these new security actors complicate the situation. It's not a new phenomenon. There have been parallel security organizations created by powers in the Middle East and North Africa region for centuries. The point I want to make is that this has happened very quickly. The rate of multiplication has changed since the beginning of this century. Leaders in many countries created new security agencies to spy on the other security agencies and to keep a multiplicity of security poles to ensure that not one became more important than the other, as a way of maintaining power and protecting themselves from any kind of overthrow of their government. And what we used to see is that these state leaders were creating these, but now we're seeing the reverse. It's the growth in these new organizations which are creating from the bottom up rather than from the top down. The third point that I would like to make is that militaries in the MENA region have always been at the center of politics. It is not a new phenomenon. It has varied considerably from country to country, and it has changed over time, and it is constantly in evolution, as one would expect in such a diverse region. Militaries were behind the rise in independence movements in the post-colonial period. Militaries were involved in subsequent coup d'etat, which took place after colonial powers were removed. The kinds of armies that exist in the Middle East and North Africa region are very diverse. Some are professional armies, some are based on merit and others on ethnicity. Some are former rebel groups which were opposing either a colonial power or an installed regime and then took power. So there's many different kinds. The fourth point I would like to make is that just as the political responses to the popular movements that have been taking place since 2011 have been varied throughout the Middle East and North Africa region, and the outcomes have been very different, so too have the military's responses varied from one country to the other. What we are seeing now is militaries are either in power or behind the power, but militaries remain central in most Middle East, North African countries. And I could go to a number of details, but I don't think time will permit. Militaries played a decisive role in forcing some dictatorships to end in several countries, Egypt, Sudan, Algeria, Tunisia. But in many cases, what we saw was not a real change, but a change in leadership and the military backing a different leader. So while there was an apparent change, militaries very often remained in control. But as I said earlier, sometimes from behind the scenes. And in other countries, particularly in the Gulf, we have seen the military have remained very loyal to the powers that be. The fifth point I would like to make is that the balance between civil society and military remains essentially the same, in spite of all of these changes. That is to say that civilians who are seeking power in the region will have to find a way to accommodate with the military. That is either for strategic purposes or they're just being very realistic about wanting to stay in power. Without support from the military, they will not succeed. And as I mentioned earlier, the military can stage democratic transitions while making pacts with those civilian leaders that they may have, in many cases, already pre-selected, giving the appearance of a democratic transition. Militaries still, in most countries, present themselves as defenders of the nation and the preservers of national identity. Most new informal security sector actors that I mentioned earlier, the transnational jihadist groups, the transnational criminal groups, the NASGs, the non-aligned state groups, they are very different from the military in that they very often do not even pretend that they are going to be providing the kinds of services that a military normally provides in other societies. The sixth and last point that I would like to make is that the COVID-19 pandemic may provide a very important opportunity to quietly quell popular protest movements without resorting to outright violence. We have seen that not only in the Middle East and North Africa region, but around the globe with authoritarian powers. That COVID-19 has been an opportunity for militaries to reimpose their will without an overt kind of support of one leader or overthrow of one regime or another. In my conclusion, though, I would like to say that the COVID-19 pandemic provides a more optimistic opportunity for the relationship between the military and civil society. We have seen in many countries that the pandemic has provided opportunities to improve civil-military relations by allowing the military to carry out tasks that are not normally associated with their mandated roles and responsibilities. We have seen it provide an opportunity for the military to present itself not just as the enforcers of rules, but as the true protectors of the population. They can ensure stability when political leaders may be coming under attack by the population and there is instability in the country. I can think of most recently of the case of Lebanon, where in the case of political instability in the country, the military provides a reassurance to the population that stability will be maintained at all costs. The military in the pandemic can provide information dissemination, that is to counter disinformation. It can provide analysis and assessment of infection rates. It can provide technology to maintain social distancing, can provide testing, contact testing, etc. So that's the positive side of what the military can do in a pandemic. But other points that I would like to conclude with, I mentioned about the accelerated proliferation of the number of security actors. And as I said, I'm rather pessimistic. I believe they are here to stay for the near future. Events since the protests of 2011 and 2019 have definitely reconfigured military structures, but the principle remains the same for the most part, i.e. the military as the inescapable power. The way in which military power is exercised is, however, more subtle, and there are fewer overt coups. They prefer to stay in the background. Professional armies under civilian control have been attempted and have had mixed results. And I think this is the final concluding and perhaps the most important remark that I would like to make in conclusion is that for all of the countries in the region, so long as there is continued weak political and governance institutions, civilian control over the military will be difficult to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. While Robert Watkins was speaking, I was thinking that in the Syria of the president Hafez al-Assad, not Bashar, the secret services were 8 different secret services. Now we can imagine that they are more than 8 acting in the same territory, considering the actions of the foreign states that are in the Syrian territory. So I would ask to Professor...
Those are the 8 that you know about.
The known ones, yes. I would ask to Professor Brahim Homansur, which other kind of subjects we can have in this moment, and especially in a moment in which the borders are less important than before, all over the world, for the possibility of the new technology to allow communications between countries without respecting the geographical borders, the physical border, but also in the Middle East with violations of borders in some areas and the difficulty to protect some borders. And we have there 3 collapsed states, at least collapse in Syria, collapse in Libya and trying to rebuild it, and collapse in Yemen too. We have several of non-state actors. The main, let's say, famous of them is the Islamic State, that has been for a while a state, and then it's now in a different condition, called as Daesh or ISIS. But there are also other kind of non-state actors, and not all of them can be bad actors. Can you explain something about what's going on in the societies?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a pleasure to participate in this conference. I'd like, of course, to talk about non-state actors or players, both violent and non-violent, or armed and non-armed state actors. The MENA region, in 2 decades, the MENA region has experienced the proliferation of non-state actors across the region, who, with a significantly growing importance, whose influence has been strengthened or enforced by the rise of regional powers and soft power in general. Amid the decline of multilateralism, of course, with or by non-state actors, I include a wide range of actors, of course, from terrorist groups into NGOs who do, as you said, positive actions. With, of course, let's start with the armed non-state actors, of course, with the growing influence and weight, of course, of armed non-state players in the region is today threatening the stability of the whole region and beyond. The reasons for such developments are, of course, many. Political instability, mainly triggered by the uprisings to 2011 and the second wave of uprisings. States' fragility, economic and environmental drivers that led to conflicts, intra-state conflicts and interstate tensions or conflicts that are exacerbated by foreign state players or foreign players, and arm transfer into battlefields. Of course, the increase in hegemonic competition within the region in order to extend states' influence or secure resources, mainly oil, or for even strategic reasons. For this category, of course, I include armed rebel groups, civilian militias, civil defense forces, terrorist groups, criminal organizations, and also private military companies who are more and more present in the region, mainly in conflict zones such as Syria and Libya today. Of course, the use of military intervention, foreign military intervention in Iraq in 2003 has triggered the fall of Saddam's regime and a rise in arms transfer from state to non-state actors. Both from Saddam's regime, of course, both from Saddam's military weapons and from outside, from neighboring states. This helped the rise of ISIS, of course, and other militias in the region. The 2011, of course, uprising that was followed by intervention and foreign support of non-state actors within different countries, Syria, Yemen, and in Libya, the Houthis in Yemen, of course, and in Syria and in Libya and Syria, of course, has led to the rise of new non-state armed actors, violent or extremist actors, and the presence of, as I said, private companies, as well as strengthening, this led also to strengthening of long-standing non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda, who were present there, were present there, and the Houthis, for instance, in addition to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Arms transfer to non-state actors, of course, just to give, to give some numbers, after the Iraqi intervention, 4.2 million small arms and light weapons have been transformed from military to armed non-state players. Of course, this includes the stockpile leakage in the country. The same scenario in Iraq happened with Libya, that has become today a hub of illicit arms trade, which of course today has taken a new stage with more sophisticated arms transferred or are flowing into this zone. Of course, several countries today are accused by the UN investigations of being involved in the arms sales to Libyan actors, especially after violating even the UN arms embargo. Even after the Berlin, the signing of Berlin, or the signing of a ceasefire, and as a result of the Berlin Conference last January. As a result, of course, 2 minutes?
Yes, yeah.
Oh. Okay, so what is threatening the region is two perhaps points: the presence of mercenaries from Sudan, or coming from Sudan, Chad, Syria. There are about 5,000 Syrian are estimated to join both GNA and pro-Haftar militias. Then there is the second phenomenon of hybridization between militant groups and terrorist groups with criminal organizations. And this makes the fight against terrorism even more challenging, as this stressed, of course, by the use of terrorist groups, international terrorist groups such as Islamic State, of local demands, local legitimate demands, in addition for recruiting, of course, strategy. I would like, of course, to mention the non-violent states, just actors, non-state actors, just to bring some optimism, of course, civil society grassroots movements, as a result of the uprisings in 2011 and the recently 2019, has brought a new form and new dynamics that helped to the emergence of a plethora of militant groups and the organized groups, NGOs, political parties struggling today or fighting today for equal rights and against corruption, etc. This, of course, has brought, of course, the civil society as a new actor within the political landscapes in this region, mainly in Algeria, Sudan. That, of course, this led to the ouster, or to press the military to oust Bouteflika in Algeria, Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, and many resignments in Lebanon, Iraq, etc. Civil society, of course, today, or the factors that led to this new actors or non-state actors is the presence of new generation, mostly young, more educated, then widespread of new technology. Today in the Maghreb region, we have 107% of the presence of smartphones. And in Algeria alone, there are 25 million Facebook accounts, which is very interesting in terms of opening this region into other regions, into the world, and what is happening in the world in general. There is perhaps the last point I'd like to mention is as non-state or non-armed non-state actors is businesses. Businesses, the case of Civital Group, the Algerian Civital, private Civital Group, is worth mentioning as a success story, because this group, which started as a national business, of course, today employing about 20,000 Algerians, has become multinational since the group has bought several European companies, such as the French brand, the French company brand, and the Italian steel maker Lucchini. So this perhaps is material for reflection for new forms of cooperation and new dynamics in terms of cooperation between the South and the North. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mansour. We read a lot and we listened a lot on TV and radio in last January about the murder of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani that was in Iraq, and it was killed by American forces. But we read a lot of, really not too much, about the Iraqi society in this phase. And I would ask to Sofia Barbarani, who has been for a long time in Iraq, what's going on there. We have a younghood with a terrible amount of unemployment, up to 40%, especially in the educated young people. And we had protests also there against the corruption, against the regime. As we know, not all the processes are genuine or positive necessarily. It depends on the case and in the moment. And price of goods had an increase also there. What's going on in that society, in this place with less than 40 million inhabitants, and also several states with their hands there?
Well, let me start off by saying that there's been a lot of talk about optimism and pessimism today, and personally, I'm definitely for optimism. And perhaps it's because I'm focusing primarily on civil society, and therefore I've looked a lot at at Iraqi youth and their role within the protests over this past year. And having also been there and covered it for 2 months and speaking to them, that gives me a lot of positivity. When we talk about civil society in the Arab world, we also have to consider that we're looking at a form of civil society that exists often exists under very incredibly difficult circumstances, whether it be sanctions, whether it be war, whether it be dictatorship, occupying forces, you name it. And often a question that comes to mind is whether a healthy and functioning form of civil society can, in fact, exist under such tremendous strain. As an optimist, I say yes, it can. And looking back over the past decade, I would argue that actually Arab civil society has grown and it thrives. It has thrived under these circumstances, and in spite of the tremendous challenges that they faced. Perhaps they haven't been as loud as the slightly more pessimistic parts or of society. I think we mentioned earlier in the previous panel that usually these are the more silent ones until finally one day you realize that they've actually made a huge change. However, I also believe that the kind of civil society that we've seen come together over the past decade are not necessarily those that are defined by Western standards. So often they're not viewed as what we would see civil society groups. To quote very briefly a professor from Temple University, Sean Yom, he said of the so-called Arab Spring, it came from the realm of informality, from everyday citizens who, linked by technology and united by common norms, managed to challenge their dictatorial status quo. And this brings me to Iraq, which is what I would like to focus on. To me, Iraq is a prime example of an Arab country that has informal and sometimes messy, but functioning civil society organizations. If we go back to 2011, when the so-called Arab Spring was happening in the rest of the region, it kind of came and went from Iraq and didn't really leave particularly tangible consequences. And many questioned whether an Arab Spring, a revolution, would happen in Iraq. But fast forward 8 years to October 2019, and as I'm sure we all remember, tens of thousands of Iraqis organized themselves to went from online to, as they say, in real life. They demonstrated against what they viewed as the unfair dismissal of a beloved lieutenant general who had been a key figure in retaking Mosul. However, the dismissal of this lieutenant general was just the tip of the iceberg. And of course, as we've seen from October 2019 until actually last night when new protests erupted in Tahrir Square, these demonstrators have more demands. And so by November 2019, what until then had largely played out online came to life in the streets, and especially in Tahrir Square, which became the epicenter of the demonstrations, and I would argue the epicenter of what is today in Iraq, the epicenter of the Iraqi civil society today. Protesters called for the dismantling of the country's political system, and soon, surprisingly, at least for myself, the prime minister had resigned. But of course, there was criticism. Much of the criticism aimed at the Iraq protests was that they were leaderless, they were scatty, they were confused in their aims. All of this suggesting that Iraq didn't in fact have a functioning civil society, just a lot of anger. I strongly disagree with this. In November, at the height of the protests, I took one look at Tahrir Square and I found a civil society that was well and healthy. Civilians from all sides, all parts of the country, all sides of the country, the various factions that everyone talks about, they'd gathered under a single banner. And whilst it was largely leaderless, there was a coherent list of demands, including, as I said, the end to what they view as a corrupt political elite, mass unemployment, and they wanted a return of basic services. Civilians were organizing themselves in a country where an inefficient government had been unable to provide for them. And as I said, this was particularly clear in Tahrir. Just to name a few things, there were medical tents peppered all throughout the square, food distribution, cleaners. I had never seen Baghdad so clean. Makeshift prayer rooms, even hairdressers, open air libraries, art, it was truly a functioning state within a dysfunctional state, and this was a result of civil society organizations that had come together under a single banner and a single aim. Of course, what started happening was the systematic kidnapping and torturing, as well as murder of hundreds of activists and demonstrators. This, to me, is also proof of the momentum that they've gained. They have now become a threat to to some parts of the government and also non-state actors. Just this month, we saw the killing of a well-known analyst, and I'd say a week ago, the kidnapping of a German artist who resides in Baghdad. Both of them supported the protests. Most recently, activist Omar Mohammed, who you probably know as Mosul Eye on Twitter, tweeted, "It's obvious, and we have been saying this for years, that the militias have started a systematic campaign to uproot the civil society in Iraq by killing and kidnapping the civil activists." To me, the continued need to target civil society activists is proof that civil society is functioning and powering through these challenges. Overall, I see an Iraq that has used its civil society organization to forward political change in the country. A political situation that has been stagnant for far too long. A civil society that hasn't tired of fighting and continues to change and improve rather than be silenced. And just to finish off, I would say that going forward, it would make a huge change, and it's incredibly important for the government to start engaging with these young men and women and actually including them in the dialogue. It's also important for the international community when dealing with Baghdad to remind them of the importance of the civil society organizations if the country is to go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Sofia Berberani. There is a country which is very close to our country for the link that we have between the population, and is Morocco. And I would ask to the Ambassador Lulinski, that is connected with us from Morocco, what has been in his country the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what social and political consequences it can have. Good afternoon. We don't listen?
Unmute, please. He's muted.
There is maybe...
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the NATO Foundation for the invitation, and I'm extremely happy and pleased to join the other panelists in this important conference. My presentation, as you mentioned, will focus on how Morocco, as a government and as a society, managed the COVID crisis, and what are the prospects of their future relations of post-COVID environment. But to do so, and for a better understanding of these dynamics, I would like to recall just for 1 or 2 minutes the main features of post-Arab Spring Morocco. You remember that after, in the middle of the Arab Spring, His Majesty took the initiative to adopt a new constitution by referendum, holding immediately elections that brought to power a coalition government led by the first party who came in these elections, the PGD, the Party for Justice and Development. These initiatives contributed to the consolidation of a reform that have been adopted since 2000 in terms of consolidating human rights, social justice, eradication of poverty, empowerment of women, and more better economic and social policy. These reforms favored the emergence of a very dynamic civil society whose actions covered the main topics on the international agenda, i.e. Promotion and protection of human rights, sustainable development, environment, and promotion of and empowerment of women and the youth. Despite efforts to build infrastructure, to attract investment, to modernize the country, Morocco did not develop at a sufficient rate to create enough jobs for young graduates for university schools and training centers. And it is mindful of these shortcomings that the king in October 2017, and I think this preempted this crisis of COVID-19, the king decided that to create a commission to think about a new economic and social model for Moroccan society, already in October 17. It is in this context, but also in this slow recovery from 2008 crisis and the regional instability due to the conflict in the Sahel, but also in Libya, that Morocco was hit, like the other countries, by COVID-19. I will focus on only 3 points given the constraint of time. How the state and society in Morocco reacted, what is the impact of COVID-19 crisis, what are the gains, and what are the shortcomings. And I will begin by how the government managed the crisis. I will respond to that by being inspired by the saying that says, when you don't have the means, the means of your politics, you adopt the politics of your means. And I think this applies to the government of Morocco. The government was mindful of at least 3 or 4 elements that determine the choices and the nature and the scope of the decisions taken. First, the insufficient healthcare system in Morocco, 25,580 doctors, which come up to 7 doctors for 10,000 Moroccans, while the average, according to WHO, is 1 doctor for 650. 2, the necessity to prevent an overwhelming figures that could challenge the capabilities available in Morocco. 3, the responsibility of the government to protect citizens, but at the same time to avoid breach of public order. And finally, an adoption of an approach with a view to trying at least to gain the minds and the heart of the population. So taking into account all these parameters, the government followed, I think, the patterns of other governments in terms of measures, but let me just highlight a few. First, there was the decision of the government to ensure a stock of 12 million masks and to adopt chloroquine as a medicine to deal with the COVID-19. 2, an early sealing of the borders. 4, an early establishment upon the instructions of His Majesty of a fund with $3.2 billion in order to deal with in order to enable the Ministry of Health to equip the hospitals. Secondly, to give financial assistance to the most vulnerable. And 3, to assist those from enterprises and companies that were hit painfully by the COVID-19. 4, distribution of stipend to 2.4 million families, and the implementation of science-based strategy of communication with the society. These measures of protection were also extended to the migrants and refugees who were residing on the Moroccan soil. What was the impact of this policy? Definitely, and like in other countries, COVID-19 reinforces the powers of the state. Two, the crisis revealed and highlighted the necessity for the government of Morocco to prioritize health, education, inclusive safety nets for the most vulnerable, and job creation, particularly for the youth. In addition to more empowerment of women. Now, what if we know that it's too early to make an assessment of the positive and the negative, but let me just try, based on the indications so far that are almost right. First, in terms of gains, there was this show of solidarity, of consensus that has never been experienced since 1975, where we had the Green March for the return of the Saharan provinces to Morocco. Second, an active role of civil society organization in discussing, addressing domestic violence, e-learning, combating illegal increase of basic goods, distribution of financial assistance to the needy among the population. 4, attention paid to the most vulnerable who benefited, as I mentioned, from financial assistance. 5, the ability of the Moroccan state and society to come up with digital solutions, and in terms of ventilators, in terms of masks, in terms of converting some industries to enable Morocco to deal with the consequences of COVID-19. And finally, the deep awareness of both the government and the society to work towards a new social contract, taking into account the lessons learned from this pandemic. In conclusion, one cannot isolate the assessment of the impact of COVID-19 and the future perspective, in isolation of the Euro-African dynamics, which are in the immediate neighborhood for Morocco. And here I cannot but emphasize the need for the member states of the Maghreb to, again, to revisit the merit of integration and economic complementarity, that if it was achieved, I'm sure that it could have avoided to the region the intervention of extra regional powers. Secondly, I would like to echo the remarks made by Mr. Karim. I know we right in the beginning of this conference on the necessity of rebalancing the North-South relation through the Mediterranean. There is a link, there is an intimacy, there is complementarity between Europe and Africa through the Mediterranean, and there is a need for this new Europe that is emerging to build a renovated and partnership that will have the ownership of both Europe and Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador Lulishki. Mr. Ambassador told us that the demand of the state in Morocco is increased, and probably this happened also in other countries, also in our country, after the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would ask to all our panelists very shortly, in 1 minute, if they can answer to this. Of course, economies will be weaker than before after this virus spread in our countries. And of course, the action of some states will be more consistent in the Middle East. And I'm talking particularly about China and Russia. Do you think that it will open the doors for an increased influence of these countries in the area, this phase, or not?
Do you think the pandemic will facilitate
the aftermath of the pandemic?
Yeah. I think we're already seeing that taking place. I don't think we're going to have to wait to the aftermath. I think the process has already started. And particularly with China. China has been extremely active in promoting its interests. As you know, there's a bigger plan, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been undertaken, which has been put in mothballs, more or less temporarily, at least until the pandemic has passed. But China is still very actively encouraging stronger economic ties particularly with countries that have been severely affected by the pandemic. We've seen that in Pakistan, for instance, a number of African countries. China has been very actively providing humanitarian assistance, particularly public health utilities that are required for combating the pandemic, whether it be simply providing masks or providing more sophisticated rehabilitation kind of equipment for people severely affected. So yes, they're definitely using this as an opportunity, but not only in developing countries.
Oh, sure.
We're seeing it happening even in Europe. And I think every country is watching very closely how that develops.
Thank you very much for this reminder. Professor Humansur.
Yes, I think, of course, the pandemic today has weakened the whole region, both oil exporters and non-oil exporters. As we see, for instance, Algeria was obliged to cut by half the annual budget. So as a result of both the recession triggered by the pandemic and the significant decline of oil prices. The same thing in Saudi Arabia is today struggling. Libya as oil exporters, of course, other countries such as Tunisia. The problem today is that China presents itself as the unique, perhaps, source of, or second source of, or financial source for the Middle East economy. I don't say that its influence will be as will be certain, but all this will depend on two things or two other actors. It will depend on the cooperation, the extent of cooperation within or between Middle East countries. Of course, we know that some countries have more ability to cope with the pandemic and even help other regional states. It will depend also on the European Union, for instance, which has closer cooperation with the southern states, or with the Middle East in general.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sofia Barbarani?
Yes, I mean, I would add that, of course, a weakened state is always more vulnerable or leaves itself open to some sort of intervention from outside. And I would also add that it's not necessarily just China and Russia, but in Iraq, for example, there has been a lot of medical equipment coming in from India recently. And also on the flip side, I would say that what's worse, too much soft power, too much intervention and help from outside versus none at all. For example, in northeastern Syria, where it's largely ruled by the Kurds, they're currently completely isolated from receiving any kind of support, both from NGOs as well as the international community in terms of help for the COVID crisis. So there's that flip side as well.
Thank you very much for reminding us also this, that it's very important about the Kurds. And Ambassador Lulishki?
Yes. Well, I would say that China did not miss.
Sorry. Can you repeat? Can you please repeat from the beginning?
I said that China did not miss the opportunity to practice its medical soft power, not only with African countries, but also with European countries and other countries. Second, I think that with the consequences of COVID-19, with the temptation of all countries to look into their own national interests and produce nationally, etc., there will be a shortage of development assistance. And so far, China has always been responsive to assistance for development. I think everything will depend, as far as our region at least is concerned, of what Europe will offer. As I mentioned before, if there is a renewal of partnership, a revitalization of the relations between Europe and North African countries and African countries in general, I think the countries will have alternatives to diversify and to complement their policy of cooperation. And last but not least, I think a lot will depend on on what will happen after the elections in the United States. If this competition, harsh competition, continues between the United States and China, it will definitely have an impact as far as this is concerned. And maybe I said last, but it was the penultimate last. I think COVID-19. I think one cannot but notice a development of South-South cooperation. Countries like Cuba, countries like even Venezuela, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Morocco, lately sent to 15 African countries some assistance for combating COVID-19. Do not forget that China considers itself as a developing country, because it is a still member of the G77. So if you add India to that, I think South-South cooperation was also among the features of the management of COVID-19, and even the perspective of what will come out after the end of this crisis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I don't know, we have time for 2 or 3 questions. Thank you very much. If you can say who you are. Thanks a lot. Ambassador?
Thank you. I have a very short question for Sofia Barbarani on Iraq in particular. What is your view about the role and the action of the new Prime Minister, Kadhimi, and what is the attitude of the street toward Kadhimi? Because as you said, the protest made the resignation of the former Prime Minister, and now you have this new figure who is supported as usual both by the United States and Iran. Yesterday he was in Tehran. In a few days he will be in Washington. So what is your view about the new course of the present government of Iraq? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Should I answer?
Yes, answer.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And as I mentioned earlier, last night, there was a new wave of protesters that took to the streets. And they were essentially saying, there's been a change in prime minister, there's been no change in policy. So he campaigned, or not his campaign, but his line was very much pro-protesters. Initially, he hasn't been in power long enough, I think, to make any substantial change. But so far, it seems to me like he's being quite weak, particularly when it comes to dealing with outside forces or neighboring countries like Iran and their militias on the ground. It is widely believed that that it was an Iran-backed militia who assassinated an analyst a few weeks ago, and there has been no consequences after that. So in terms of him dealing with the demands of the protesters for the time being, I would say he's incredibly unpopular, and there might be a new wave of big demonstrations coming up.
Thank you very much. Another question? There was, okay.
Yes, Maurizio Geri from Three Stones International. My question is for Mr. Watkins regarding the civilian control of militaries in the process of democratization. Do you think which model or which example we can follow? Because Tunisia, as we know, is the only Arab Spring successful situation, but the militaries didn't probably play the big role, and the place where the militaries played the biggest role was Egypt, and finally failed. So do you have a suggestion for some type of, I don't say model, but at least example successful in which the actor of militaries was included in a sustainable democratization? Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Could I add on that, because it's very connected to the first chapter, to the former one. Thank you. I'm Stefano Marcuzzi. I'm from the foundation. In light of the proliferation of militias that has been mentioned earlier on, especially in countries like Syria and Libya, and their embeddedness in the social context, would you say that the disarmament of those militias and their reorganization into a national army is still an objective to be pursued by the international community? Or should we come to the conclusion that some countries can simply live without an army? And if so, what consequences can we see for those countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Two very tough questions. And as I said, I'm a bit of a pessimist, so I'm not painting a happy story in terms of the near future. I'm a long-term optimist, but a short-term pessimist, I think is the best way of putting it. If we look at the region, two examples that come to mind to answer your question about civilian control over the military. We've seen a situation in Iraq after the American invasion in 2003, where the Americans tried to establish a very structured civilian control over the army, and it failed miserably. And Iraq is one of those examples, and Ambassador Makdaz, who was speaking previously, spoke. I think he said it very clearly that you cannot impose change. You can provide examples, you can give suggestions, but change has to come from within if it's going to be durable. Imposed solutions always fail. And I think Iraq we use as a perfect example of how that can fail. So there is indeed not one model, and I think that was another point actually that he made. There's not one model of how civilian control over the military can take place. There are different pathways. Tunisia, you mentioned, is one of the examples where there's some hope for a strong civilian control over the authority. And I think it's working on the governance institutions, which I said in my conclusions. It's never going to happen unless there's not a real reform of the governance institutions. You can look particularly at Parliament, the role that Parliament can play in terms of putting into place controls over the budgets. So there's accountability within the security services. And Tunisia is certainly moving in that direction far faster than other countries that have undergone this revolution. There are many countries like Morocco which didn't undergo a revolution. It was more of an evolution. And those fundamental controls are being put into place slowly but surely, and great progress has been made there as well. So in the short term, not very optimistic, but hopefully if there's a concerted effort to help countries develop their own civilian control methods, then there could be some progress. Is disarmament still possible? It's interesting, particularly in countries that are in conflict right now in the Middle East, the Yemens, the Syrias, and the Libyas. I think most countries that are realistic about how that can develop, it's not very likely that there's going to be the kind of classic DDR that we have talked about before, disarmament and demobilization, rehabilitation. That is an ideal that one can strive towards, but I think in order to be realistic about what can actually be achieved, for instance, I think it's impossible to look at transnational criminal organizations or transnational jihadist organizations being demobilized and integrated into the security forces. There are some militias in some countries which are based on ethnicity, are based on tribal interests, and so on, where there is greater hope for them to be integrated. But the question still comes back to whether regimes are interested in having that happen, because they serve their purposes to maintain them in power. So short term, not very optimistic.
Thank you very much. There is another question. So okay, if they are very fast, we can do both. But first of all, sorry, behind, yes, yeah, okay. Lady first, as usual.
Gentleman.
So, good afternoon, and thank you for your very interesting remarks. I'm Francesca Starte, and I'm a freelance consultant, and I'm a member of Women in International Security Italy. Since this panel is dedicated to civil society issues, and this question is open to all panelists, actually.
We have no time for all. Someone will answer, but not all. Yes.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
just for the time.
I just wanted to ask your opinion regarding the progresses in the implementation of Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the MENA region, since this year also marks the 28th anniversary of the resolution 1325. Thank you.
Okay, and the last one.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Federico Siragusa. I'm currently working I'm from local administration, specifically the legal office and insurance claims. I have a question specifically for Sofia Barbarani. If there may have been something that I might have misunderstood. Before you were talking about the creation of healthy, functioning society despite all the malfunctioning going on. However, as is known, Iraq has been tormented by malfunction ever since Iraq has been created by the post-World War I treaties, where every single clan and later every single nation state would satisfy the interests of whoever was their best customer. Before, you said that you saw that that an Iraqi society, a united Iraqi society, was being created. But you kept mentioning Baghdad and you kept mentioning Tahrir Square. Now, were these circumstances that you have illustrated before also empirically verified in other areas of Iraq, such as Erbil with the Kurds, in Basra, in Tikrit, in Samarra, etc.? Or was it only like what happened in Lebanon, where they would show Beirut that was going on under massive development, while the other areas were left to open neglect? And also, if I can add something a little bit more.
No, I'm sorry. We are very late, so okay. I'm sorry. Okay, I can promise that I will tell to Sofia Barbarani if she can talk with you for 5 minutes after the debate. I'm sorry, but I have to respect the timing. And the floor is yours.
Yeah. So just taking it from this last question. No, it wasn't only Baghdad. I spoke specifically of Baghdad because that's where I was reporting from at the time. But based on other colleagues and my own sources on the ground, this kind of unity came together throughout the whole country. However, Baghdad does tend to have a slightly more mixed community, and therefore you really saw people from all ages, ethnicities and religions coming together under this unified banner. And then the first question, women in business, correct?
The progress is made in the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda since the uprisings of post-2011.
I think maybe more of a North Africa answer might be best than Iraq and Syria. I would.
You can.
I can say something if you wish.
Huh?
I would, pass it on
you
to.
You will.
No, I don't have
to anyone else?
Yeah.
I could make a comment.
Yeah. Okay.
So what are the chances of the Women, Peace, Security agenda being furthered in the Middle East, North Africa region as a result of the uprising? Well, I would say a lot of progress has been made. And Sophia mentioned in Iraq, for instance, that there has been a great growth in civil society organizations. And I think that is in general true for the entire region, that there has been a great resurgence of and recognition of the importance of civil society organizations in general terms. But I think that's the most important starting point, because women are part of that process. And there has been an enormous increase in the number of women or women-based organizations. And particularly, this is the second point that I make, that particularly when it comes to mediation. And I have seen in the work that we do in Yemen and in Syria and in Libya, women are getting much more involved in mediation process, because there is a far greater recognition of the importance of that inclusivity of women in particular and of youth groups. So we get around from the stereotypes of male-based negotiations. The importance of women mediators has been highly recognized. There's an enormous way to go. I don't want to give a rosy view of that, but I think important steps have been made, and that comes within the package of greater civil society organization representation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you, and for your questions, and to Ambassador Lulishki, to Sofia Barbarani, to Professor Mansour and Robert Watkins. And thank you very much for reminding us the importance to support Tunisia and his successful or not unsuccessful experiment after 2011 in trying to improve the democracy. Thanks a lot. And thank you to Marco Belpoliti, Director of the NATO Foundation, College Foundation, and to Federica Lollo and to all the staff. Thank you very much. And good evening.
I would like to say just a few words, thanking, of course, the panel, very, very good, but also to think that we are at the close of our works. After all, it has been a long day, longer than we thought in the beginning, perhaps, just because maybe of the heat, I don't know. The discussion, to me, I am a very difficult person, even with myself. I think the discussion was very good. Very good. Good moderators, Claire, of course, you, and good speakers. Topics, I think they were interesting. And we knew something new. I didn't know much about Iraq before, in that respect, for instance. And so I hope they have enjoyed the afternoon, and I wish you a very good evening to everybody. And we close the conference.
Thank you very much.